fascinating yesterday, those videos?
I barely understood anything.
If you were able to understand a lot of the details and technicality of it, it does get really interesting because there's a whole new set of numbers, right? You know, back in, well, maybe not, but from what I understand, they did not teach that whole circle thing anymore, did they? Back in, was it Math 7, Math 8?
I remember.
Do you? See? I'm glad somebody, where you got, number system. And then inside the number system, you've got real numbers, right? And it was always the bigger circle. This was real numbers. And then they had a smaller circle called the irrational numbers, right? And you worked with this all the way through Algebra 1, right? So for let's see, freshmen, you were what, 14 years old? So for the first 9 years of your education, you worked under this system, right? Real numbers, irrational numbers. Isn't it fascinating that we actually have a third number system? Ooh, you guys are excited. I know, contain yourselves, please, please, please. There's a third system, okay? Imaginary numbers. And that's what that whole video series was about yesterday. I know it was a little dry. It's always dry when you're watching math videos. Like when you guys go home and you watch, my videos online on Google Classroom. Because I know you do. I know it. You guys are secret Mr. D watchers, right? I know you are. It can get dry, though, sometimes, right? So, aren't you excited there's 3 number systems? No? Anyone? Anyone excited? No? Caitlin, you excited?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And they introduced it by saying, hey, there is a solution to taking the square roots of a negative number. Okay? In fact, we're going to use a variable for the square root of negative 1. We're going to call it I. Exciting, huh? New mathematical concept. Exciting. So we have we have an order of the way that we put our answer. And probably one of the harder thing is to remember this order. Right? So we have, what we're going to do is, just like when we simplify, remember this was on a lot of your quizzes, to simplify the square root of 27, we would find factors of 27 that had a perfect square, right? Yeah, 9 and 3. So we would put the perfect square, dummy. We would put the square root of the perfect square factor first, then the square root of 3, because the square root of 3 is an irrational number, right? We called it the leftover. So then we would take the square root of 9, which would be 3, and then we would put the square root, the irrational number, next. Just like 3x. We don't put x3, we put 3x, right? Yeah, it's just sounds better. Well, we have an order of the way that we're going to be putting this I in there, okay? So we're going to have our perfect square. This would be our 3. And then we have our I, and then we have whatever's left over, or our irrational number that would have been our square root of 3. If this would have been a negative 27, we would have had an I in there. Okay, so this order is really important because it just, when you start working with more involved problems, you need that order, that consistency, okay? All right, so let's look at the square root of negative 9, number 1. just like we had up here, we're going to split it up. We're going to put our perfect square first. So I have the square root of 9. I don't have anything left over, but then I do have that negative, or the square root of negative 1, right? Because negative 1 times 9 is negative 9, just like 3 times 9 is 27. All right. Now, we know that the square root of negative 1 equals I. So my answer here is going to be my perfect square, which is 3. And then instead of square root of negative 1, I'm going to substitute in the I. See how that order came about? That's my answer. Easy peasy, right? You can do this blindfolded. You could do this even while you're on your phones. Okay, number 2. I'm going to separate this. Well, I have no perfect square because the square root of 6 is not perfect. So then I'm going to move over to my square root of negative 1. So I have square root of negative 1, and then my leftover is the square root of 6, right? Going to substitute in I for my square root of negative 1. So my answer, I square root of 6.
So since there's no square, you would leave that out, and negative 1 times the I, and then the leftover is 6.
Yes. Or, you could think of it this way. And this is all up to you. You could think of it as square root of negative 6 equals square root of 6 times square root of negative 1. Just be careful when you go to put it in order that your real numbers first. Okay? It's always your real number first, and then your imaginary number second. And then your third is going to be your irrational. Okay, so you're looking at square root of 6 and negative 1. While you don't have any real numbers, your imaginary number is going to be next. So this is going to be I, and then your irrational square root of 6. However you want to look at it. Personally, I just remember the order they're in, and that way I don't have to worry about putting them in order when I'm simplifying. It's up to you. Okay, number 3, if you want to put them in order, there is a perfect square that's a factor of 8, right? Negative square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And then we have the square root of negative 1 is our I, the middle one. So square root of 4 is 2. Square root of negative 1 is I. And then my leftover is square root of 2. No, don't be. It's going to take, like I said, it's going to take a while. Now, the other way is, hey, I'm not going to worry about the order until the end. So another way to do this is, hey, I know 8's got a perfect square the way that we've been doing it all this time, right? Square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And then I've got that negative to worry about, square root of negative 1. Now put them in order. Square root of 2 is my real, is 2. Then I need my imaginary, so the square root of negative 1 is my I. And then my irrational, or leftover, square root of 2. So 2 different ways of doing the same problem. You either organize it in the beginning, or you organize it at the end. It's up to you which way you want to do it. Any questions? Now we're going to solve two quadratic equations by taking the square roots, which was the second method I showed you, right? And then by completing the square, which was the third method I showed you. So let's solve this quadratic equation by taking the square roots. In order to do that, I have to get that x squared by itself. So the first thing I'm going to do, subtract 10 from both sides. So I get 3x squared equals negative 26 minus negative 10, negative 36, right? Divide both sides by the coefficient 3. So I get x squared equals negative 36 divided by 3, negative 12. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, get rid of that power 2 for the x. So I get x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 12. Now we're going to have to go ahead and simplify the square root of negative 12, right? X equals plus or minus, well, I know I got a negative 1 in there, so I'm going to put my negative 1 out. Now, what are the factors of 12 where one of the factors is a perfect square? 4 and 3, right? So square root of 4 and then the square root of 3.
And then we simplify and we get 2i square root 3.
Perfect. Perfect. Good. Okay, number 5. Let's see. Completing the square. The first thing I have to do is get ax squared plus bx equal to c. So I have to get rid of that plus 30, so I'm going to minus 30. Now, in your quizzes last week, I had a lot of you, like, move that 30 over here, just move it, and there was a plus 30 here, or you would take half of the b, square it, and then put it on this side, leave the 30 there. There are a lot of interesting stuff going on. The first thing you have to do is move this c over there. Right? So subtract the 30 first. So I get my x squared, that's my ax squared, plus my bx, which is 10x here, and then I have my minus 30. 0 minus 30 is minus 30.
Divide it by 2 and see.
Yeah, and then we have to figure out that perfect square to add. And as Aiden said, we're going to take our b, divide it by 2, b divided by 2, and square it. So 10 divided by 2 is 5. Square it, which is 25. That's what we're going to add to both sides. Okay. Then I get my perfect squared binomial. My x, my variable, goes here.
Plus 5.
Plus 5, my base, good, squared. Don't put the 25 there, put the negative 30, this goes there, negative 5. good. Square root both sides. I can now drop my parentheses. Plus or minus the square root of -5. Okay, I have to get rid of x by itself, so I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. Be careful here, these are unlike terms, right? So I got my x, got my -5, plus or minus. I'm going to have to simplify square root of -5 to, let's see, I'm going to put my I first. I goes before square root of 5. So square root of -1, square root of 5, finally -5, plus or minus I square root of 5. A lot of stuff going on there, right?
So when it said like for a -5, plus or minus -5, if we were like, and then we switched it to be the plus or minus -1, the -5 turns into a positive.
Yeah, well, we're splitting this up, right? We're taking -5, just like we were simplifying, like the square root of 27. We would just take those two factors, multiply them together, right? That's all we're doing here. So we're taking our -5, splitting up those factors to -1 times 5. Okay. Now we can substitute in I for -1, right? I for -1, square root of -1. So we put I in for that, and then I have my leftover square root of 5. Okay? Any other questions? Now, can you guys do this with the quadratic formula too? The fourth method I showed you? All right, should be able to do it. Because it's on your little homework sheet there. All right, guys, you've got, I don't know, 4 hours to do that little 6 problem, so. Yes, you can listen to music. As always, be responsible with your phones. You should